All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is video 4 of part 5. This is a continuation of part 5, and we're just going to take off where we left last time. Part 5 will have one more video in it, so there will be 5 videos in all for part 5. So I said in the last video that in this video I'm going to be dealing with this dichotomy of altruism versus egoism. So in the last video we went over all these different dichotomies that were set up by the ascetic ideal, which I've argued is the left hemisphere way of thinking about values and morality. Right? It sets up these dichotomies and elevates one over the other. It elevated reason over instinct, or the soul or mind over the body. And it also elevated altruism over egoism. And I'm going to make the case that this is a kind of pathology in this video. So the argument I'm going to make is basically this. In the first place, pure altruism doesn't exist in nature, and neither does pure egoism. Right? This is a false dichotomy. It might be a useful way of talking in everyday conversation, but these things don't really exist in nature, at least not in the way that they tend to be understood in moral terms. And so these externally imposed moralities cannot really be promoting altruism in any pure sense. So what is it exactly that they are promoting? And what I will suggest is that morality is always and can always be only doing one thing. It's promoting the adherence to the norms of a particular group. So in concert with Jonathan Haidt, I will be suggesting and arguing that conventional morality is a matrix. A matrix is a consensual hallucination. We agree to believe in certain concepts, certain moral concepts that don't have any ontological reality, but we believe in them, and our belief in the objectivity of these moral ideals blinds us. It blinds us to the coherence of alternative moral frameworks, of alternative moralities, and that's what makes it a matrix. Right? A matrix is a consensual hallucination. That's what morality is. The elevation of altruism over egoism is pathological because it promotes an ideal that cannot be actually attained in the world. Right? We cannot actually act purely altruistically. And so that induces this kind of pervasive guilt. It also blocks the healthy integration of altruistic and egoistic motivations. Right? What you want is for your, let's say, your selfish desires and your altruistic desires, which we all have those to one degree or another. You want them to be functionally integrated such that they're going in the same direction, so that you're getting what you want out of life, and at the same time you are promoting the interests, your extended interests in the world. We're going to talk about what that means here in a minute. And it also encourages a kind of hyper-conformity to group norms or group values. Nietzsche in Ecce Homo said about this dichotomy between altruism and egoism, and I quote, "The decisive symptom that shows how the priest, including those crypto-priests, the philosophers, has become master quite generally, and not only within a certain religious community, and that the morality of decadence, the will to the end, has become accepted as morality itself, is the fact that what is unegoistic is everywhere assigned absolute value, while what is egoistic is met with hostility. Whoever is at odds with me about that is, to my mind, infected, but all the world is at odds with me." End quote. And I agree. I think this is one of the most deeply seated mistakes that people make. And I especially see this in like people who consider themselves like spiritual people and all this, which I don't tend to use that label for myself, but they also have they have this sort of idea that like the goal is to become this egoless, purely compassionate being. And it's like, well, good luck with that, but it's not going to happen, right? It's not the kind of thing that you are, and it's not the kind of thing you can be. It's a false ideal, and it generally just induces a kind of self-deception. Either you're going to think that you're like that when you're really not, and develop some false arrogance around that, or you're going to beat yourself up because you can never attain that ideal. So this is the ascetic ideal, right? It praises altruism and denigrates egoism, and this sounds nice. We don't like people who are overly egoistic, right? Sociopaths and narcissists and people who abuse people and manipulate people to get what they want out of life, right? We don't like those people, and like, fair enough. But there's a deep problem, right, with this denigration of egoistic motivations. I think there's multiple problems with it. We're not going to talk about all of the problems with it in this video, but this is one of them. And I think it's probably the fundamental problem is that purely altruistic motives simply don't exist in nature, at least not in the way that people who think moralistically think about them. and that means that altruism and egoism is a false dichotomy, right? All motivations have the same ultimate source, right? This is evolutionary psychology in a nutshell, right? All motivations have the same ultimate source, which is in the drives or the psychological adaptations that have evolved in us because they increased the inclusive fitness of our ancestors. And so what I'm going to do here is briefly review 3 ultimate evolutionary sources of what we would call altruism. These are kin altruism, reciprocal altruism, and then mutualism or interdependence. And I'm going to assume that my listeners here, may not be the right assumption, but I'm going to assume that you have some basic understanding of evolutionary theory, and I'm not going to go over like sort of what inclusive fitness is and things like that. That's something you'll have to learn somewhere else if you need to. So talking about kin altruism first, right? So, mothers nurse their infants, obviously. And you might think of that as a kind of altruism, and maybe it is. Maybe we should think about it as a kind of altruism. It's clearly a sacrifice on the part of the mother for her infant. And people and animals will often risk their own safety to protect their genetic relatives. We see this in animals who are like, who give warning cries about predators, right? So if you give the warning cry, you're at a greater risk of being preyed upon, but you're helping your group, generally speaking, your family members, to avoid the predator. So from an ultimate or evolutionary perspective, what is it that can explain these kinds of behaviors? And they can be explained in terms of kin altruism. Evolution has instilled in us a drive to behave altruistically towards those individuals who we detect are our genetic relatives. So I guess I lied. I guess I am going to talk a little bit about inclusive fitness here. So we are going to go over the concept of inclusive fitness a little bit here. So ever since the modern synthesis of modern genetics and Darwinian evolution has been construed as being about changes in gene frequencies in a population. So when gene frequencies change in a population, so the amount of individuals in a population who contain a certain allele, who carry a certain allele, that's evolution, basically. Genetic variants are selected based on their capacity to reproduce themselves into future generations. At least that's what they're selected for when there's adaptation going on. So besides random variation, which is referred to as genetic drift, genetic variants can reproduce themselves into future generations in one of 2 ways. They can promote the reproductive success of the organism they reside in, which is like you, right? So you have genes, and they can create adaptations that will promote your own reproductive success, or they can promote the reproductive success of individuals who are statistically more likely than a random individual to contain a copy of the same genetic variant. Okay, that just means people who are genetically related to you. Your selfish genes can promote their selfish interests by promoting the success of people who are genetically related to you. So your parents and siblings have a 50% chance of having the same genetic variant as you because they share, on average, 50% of your genes. Your grandparents, half siblings, and so on have a 25% chance. Your first cousins have a 12.5% chance, and so on. So natural selection does not maximize individual reproductive success. It selects for adaptations that maximize your inclusive fitness. And the technical definition of inclusive fitness is the sum of the contribution of an individual to its own reproductive success and its contribution to the reproductive success of other individuals, weighted by a coefficient of relatedness that summarizes the average genetic similarity between the former individual and the latter ones. Okay, well, that's, it just means that you can increase your own evolutionary success. And of course, we don't consciously do this, right? We're not thinking about, I need to increase my genetic success. Like, nobody thinks that way, but it doesn't matter, right? We execute adaptations that we're selected for because they increased our inclusive fitness, which means our own reproductive success or the reproductive success of those who we have some genetic relation to. So evolution has not made us completely selfish, but it has made us nepotistic. And in summarizing this idea, the biologist J.B.S. Haldane is reported to have jokingly said that he would lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins, because those add up to the same coefficient of relatedness. So that is kin altruism. We don't need to invoke any kind of purely altruistic motives to explain why we're nice to genetic relatives, basically. So moving on to reciprocal altruism. In 1971, the biologist Robert Trivers published what is now a very famous paper about reciprocal altruism. So I'm going to read a summary of that paper by Segerstrail, 2016. Segerstrail said, and I quote, "Reciprocal altruism, according to Trivers, is altruism that occurs between unrelated individuals when there will be repayment, or at least the promise of repayment, of the altruistic act in the future. An example is mutual grooming among birds and mammals. For reciprocity to work, individuals would need to be able to recognize each other at a future time, and many animals seem capable of that. A problem is cheating, that is, taking advantage of a benefit offered but then not paying back. Trivers suggested that many of the human psychological characteristics have evolved for us to be able to cheat, to detect cheaters, and to avoid being detected if cheating." End quote. And so we have many psychological adaptations that take advantage of reciprocity, reciprocal relationships between us and other people. Friendships are largely about reciprocity. They're not entirely about reciprocity. Friendships aren't, but they're partly that. And we have reciprocal relationships even within people in our family, but other people as well, colleagues and coworkers and things like that. And then mutualism. Mutualism is a form of cooperation that occurs because everybody participating in the cooperative activity has the potential to benefit from that activity. That means that mutualism just involves participating in a non-zero-sum game, which we talked about in part 3. Michael Tomasello argues that humans have evolved psychological mechanisms for the purpose of facilitating mutualism, and that this was an important aspect in the evolution of our propensity for cooperation. So Tomasello said about this, and I quote, "Mutualistic collaboration is responsible for many of the most distinctive characteristics of human cooperative cognition and sociality. It is responsible in the sense that, early in human evolution, the need for specific types of mutualistic collaboration created the adaptive conditions within which an especially intricate and complex set of proximate mechanisms evolved for regulating social coordination and communication, shared intentionality." So, end quote. And so we largely learned, we evolved this ability to communicate and collaborate at scale because we involved ourselves in these mutualistic situations, these non-zero-sum situations. That's what Tomasello is suggesting there. And this allowed us to evolve this propensity for what he calls shared intentionality. We're going to talk more about that in a later video, not this one. So all of these, right, kin selection, reciprocity, and mutualism, they can all be understood as particular manifestations of fitness interdependence, what is called fitness interdependence, which is just another way of talking about a non-zero-sum relationship. Fitness interdependence occurs whenever my fitness is correlated with another organism's fitness, such that my fitness can be increased by increasing their fitness too. So this is like what happens when you have children, clearly, right? The child's fitness is correlated with your own inclusive fitness. But it also occurs with your friends, generally speaking. If you have like a long-term friendship with somebody, you're dependent on each other to some degree, and like their success is your success and vice versa. But this is also the case when we're involved in large-scale positive sum interactions. Well, then the well-being of the people around me actually increases my own inclusive fitness as well. And so we're all in this sort of non-zero-sum situation together. Tomasello, again, he argued that with the advent of mutualistic collaborative foraging, right, our propensity to hunt and gather in groups cooperatively and things like that, especially things like big game hunting, human beings became much more interdependent than our primate cousins, and that's largely why we ended up going down the evolutionary trajectory we went down. So the point here is to make this case that you don't have selfish or selfless interests from an evolutionary perspective. Your interests are extended into the world, right? They're not entirely selfish, and they're not entirely altruistic either. So evolutionary forces like kin selection and mutualism and reciprocal altruism and fitness interdependence have conspired to create what you might call a self that is not entirely internal, right? It's distributed in the world. Your interests, your real interests, are distributed out in the world. So acting in what you might call your self-interest, as long as we have the proper understanding of what I mean by self, in your self-interest from an evolutionary perspective does not mean being a selfish sociopath, right? That's the wrong way of thinking about it. It means being integrated into the world such that your goals are taking into account your own interests, right? Your own, what you might call selfish interests, your family and friends' interests, the interests of your culture, because you're in an interdependent relationship with your culture. And I would argue at this point in time, the world at large, because we're now in this situation where we're in an interdependent relationship with everyone else in the world, given the, we talked about this in part 3, the advent of intrinsic existential risks. And when you have goals that fulfill these criteria, they are going to be, I will suggest, maximally motivating and maximally meaningful, because they're not going to generate internal conflict between the different parts of you that have different, relative interests. We're going to come back to that point when we discuss the psychology of meaning. But my point here is just to say that this, you are kind of a you're like a series of concentric circles. You have your self-interest, and then your family's interest, and then the interest of your community and your culture and the world at large, right? All of those things are really it is really, you have genuine interests, right, in furthering all of those levels of analysis, and furthering with the well-being, let's say, of all of those levels of analysis. Maybe well-being is not the right word, but hopefully you get what I mean here. So, it may be the case that altruism and egoism make for decent heuristics in everyday conversation, but the fact is that our actual evolved interests defy that dichotomy, right? They just don't fit into it very well. In reality, what we are always doing is what the evolutionary psychologists would say: we are always executing adaptations, and those adaptations evolved because they increased the inclusive fitness of our ancestors. And so we have evolved to have warm feelings, right, towards our family and our friends, and those feelings compel us to behave in ways that further our real, genuine interests, right, which cannot be neatly categorized as either selfish or selfless, right? It's in my real, genuine interest to be a good friend, let's say, or to be or to not, be a burden on my family and things like that, right? That's a part of my real interest. And I think for some people that might sound like it's a callous or cynical take on the world, but I think that's wrong. It's not callous or cynical at all. It means that, altruism is not something that's like unnatural, right? It's perfectly natural. But so is selfishness, right? What we would normally call selfishness. Those are both perfectly natural. They're in the distinction between them is not nearly as clear as we might think it is. And so if this seems like a callous or cynical take on the world, I would suggest that it's only because we're in the habit, and a bad habit, of thinking moralistically, meaning that we're in a habit of thinking in terms of a false and romantic and naive understanding of human motivation and what human motivation is really like. So, what human motivation is really like is that we're always pursuing our evolved interests, right? We're doing this consciously or unconsciously. Many people do it unconsciously, right? Especially if you're really moralistic, right? Because if you're really moralistic, if you've really adopted a very moralistic view of the world, then you can't admit to yourself that you're always pursuing your own evolved interests, right? Because then you would be acting immorally. And so you have to suppress those motivations. And that's a form of self-deception, but they're still acting themselves out, right? You're not getting rid of those motivations, but they're either going to act themselves out consciously or unconsciously. So some people may pursue their evolved interests in ways that appear more altruistic, and others may do it in a way that appears more egoistic, but ultimately those have the same source. And so this means that human morality, right, these externally imposed moralities, right, like that God is telling us what to do, or karma, or whatever it may be, these cannot be really promoting altruism in a pure sense, because that's an ideal that it's impossible to actually act out. Right? People may think that they're behaving purely altruistically, but they're not. And I'm not denying the reality of like self-sacrifice and things like that. But those things are still the execution of adaptations that evolved because they promoted our inclusive fitness. We shouldn't be cynical about that. Like, it's not a bad thing, but acting purely altruistically is something that is perfectly impossible in nature. And so you can't do that, and these moralities can't be really promoting that. So what are they promoting, right? What are they actually promoting? And I'm going to argue that understanding this is going to be key for understanding why it is that the elevation of altruism over egoism is ultimately pathological. And in order to do this, we're going to have to go over some moral psychology. So I'm going to make 3 points here. I need to make 3 points here, and I'm largely going to be drawing on the work of Jonathan Haidt. The first point is that moral intuitions what you might call gut feelings or emotional reactions to things, are what really drives moral judgment. Moral reasoning, moral reasons, the reasons we come up with, that comes along afterwards to justify our intuitions or our emotional reactions. This is, of course, largely the same argument that we talked about in the last video in this part, that reasoning is for justification. And that's true. That's as true in the realm of morality as it is anywhere else. Moral intuitions vary widely from culture to culture, and weird people have especially weird moral intuitions. And morality, as it is normally understood, is a consensual hallucination. Right? I think Jonathan Haidt is right about this, and it blinds us to the coherence of alternative moralities. So Jonathan Haidt has this very famous paper from 2001 called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail, a social intuitionist approach to moral judgment. And this paper, I would suggest, represented a turning point, a real turning point in the study of moral psychology. The rationalists had dominated moral psychology for a long time, at least since the cognitive revolution in the 1950s. And the rationalists argued that moral development was the result of increasingly sophisticated moral reasoning over the course of development. So in a nutshell, the rationalists believe the opposite of what we just said. They believe that moral reasoning causes moral judgment, that we reason about moral ideals, and then that causes us to make moral judgments. And of course, Jonathan Haidt inverted this theory. He reviews a wealth of evidence, and there's, I think at this point, overwhelming evidence, in my opinion, indicating that moral reasoning is something that comes along after the judgment has been made. Right? We make the judgment first, and then we come up with reasons to justify it. So in Haidt's view, moral reasoning takes place not so that we can make moral decisions, but so that we can justify our intuitive moral judgments to other people. It plays a social function. So moral reasoning itself contributes very little, and typically virtually nothing, to the actual decision-making process. It's more of a way to justify the decisions that we've already made. So contrary to the rationalist, right, we do not reason our way into moral judgments. We make them automatically and intuitively. So Haidt reviews evidence that people have automatic reactions to moral dilemmas, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these moral dilemmas, which are kind of interesting, which are used to study this sort of thing. So one is, and these are both from The Righteous Mind, and I quote, "A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this." End quote. So is that moral or immoral? Well, most people are going to immediately say that's very immoral, right? You can't eat your dog, okay? But if, when you try to ask people to give reasons for this, right, they run out of reasons very quickly, right? Because of course, you can say, well, maybe the dog was unclean. You can say, no, the dog had no diseases. Okay, was it still immoral? And they knew that the dog didn't have a disease, And so you can go through all the reasons, but it doesn't matter. You're not getting rid of that underlying intuition that something immoral has taken place. The next one is a man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken, but before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it, and he cooks it and eats it. I don't know why that's so funny. Okay, so is that immoral? Is that moral or immoral? Well, most people are going to say immediately that that's immoral. People have this automatic and intuitive moral reaction to these situations, and then they come up with reasons to justify that intuition. Again, with the chicken example, you can, people are going to come up with reasons, but you can go through those reasons and knock them down pretty easily. Like he's not going to get a disease. Maybe even he wears a condom. Sorry. Okay. So these emotional reactions, the emotional reactions that people have to the situation and not the articulable reasons, are the true proximate causes of moral judgments. Moving on. So, okay, where is it that these moral reactions come from, right? So we have automatic emotional reactions to moral dilemmas. Where do those come from? And Haidt has a theory of moral development, and we're going to talk about that on the next page, but he recognizes that moral intuitions are partially innate. So in the sense that all normally developing children develop some similar moral intuitions, especially about fairness and justice and things like that. But at the same time, different cultures massively differ in many of their basic moral intuitions. on how, issues around hierarchy, issues around differences between men and women, and so on, right? There are massive differences between cultures. And Jonathan Haidt describes, and I think this is a really interesting quote, so I'm going to read it in full. He describes how when he visited India, he found himself in a very different moral matrix from the one that he grew up in. He grew up in liberal New York as an atheist Jew, basically, and of course he has a very different moral matrix than what you're going to find in the much more conservative India. And so he described that, and I quote, "I dined with men whose wives silently served us and then retreated to the kitchen, not speaking to me the entire evening. I was told to be stricter with my servants and to stop thanking them for serving me. I watched people bathe in and cook with visibly polluted water that was held to be sacred. In short, I was immersed in a sex-segregated, hierarchically stratified, devoutly religious society, and I was committed to understanding it on its own terms, not on mine. It only took a few weeks for my dissonance to disappear, not because I was a natural anthropologist, but because the normal human capacity for empathy kicked in. I liked these people who were hosting me, helping me, and teaching me. Wherever I went, people were kind to me. And when you're grateful to people, it's easier to adopt their perspective, rather than automatically rejecting the men as sexist oppressors and pitying the women, children, and servants as helpless victims. I began to see a moral world in which families, not individuals, are the basic unit of society, and the members of each extended family, including its servants, are intensely interdependent. In this world, equality and personal autonomy were not sacred values. Honoring elders, gods, and guests, protecting subordinates, and fulfilling one's role-based duties were more important." End quote. And so this is a totally, when I talk about the moral matrix, right, this is what I'm talking about. He found himself in a world where people treated women in ways that you cannot treat women in the Western world. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not complaining about that. And you cannot treat your servants in a particular way. And the relations between people, between members of a family tend to be very different in the West than they are in India. And of course, they're devoutly, the people he stayed with were devoutly religious in a way that few people are in the Western world today. And so he found himself in a different kind of world, right? He was in a different kind of world with different assumptions, different traditions, different habits, different moral intuitions. And as a moral psychologist, he was trying to understand it on its own terms, and that involves you can't be constantly judging it if you're going to do that. So if you share the moral matrix of a typical Western person, especially somebody who came from Haidt's situation, right, a liberal New Yorker, right, then the subjugation of women, right, and the authoritative attitude towards servants and the strict devotion to religious ritual of these Indian people will seem either, on the one hand, very silly. I think that's how many people would think about it, or many people, I think, would just think of it as evil, right, as being totally immoral. But what has to be recognized here is that and I think we really get this in some sense, if you were raised in their world, you would have the same moral intuitions that they do, very likely anyways. It's very likely that you would anyways. And so Haidt's theory of moral development recognizes this fact, right, that moral intuitions are partially innate. We have some similar intuitions that occur cross-culturally, but at the same time, they can vary quite widely from culture to culture. And so Haidt summarizes his theory of moral development as such, and I quote, this is from the 2001 paper: "Moral development is primarily a matter of the maturation and cultural shaping of endogenous intuitions. People can acquire explicit propositional knowledge about right and wrong in adulthood, but it is primarily through participation in custom complexes involving sensory, motor, and other forms of implicit knowledge shared with one's peers during the sensitive period of late childhood and adolescence that one comes to feel physically and emotionally the self-evident truth of moral propositions," end quote. And that's really important, right? Is that when you're immersed in a culture, you come to feel as if the moral assumptions of that culture are self-evident, right? Because everyone around you is taking on those assumptions, right? And it seems like it's so obvious. The term custom complex there is meant to capture this idea that cultural inheritance it includes much more than just verbal beliefs, right? We're not just, it's not like people are just telling us what to do, right? We're observing the way that people interact with each other, the way that people behave, the rituals they engage in, right? All this stuff, we're soaking in everything as we grow up. And so much of our cultural knowledge and our cultural heritage is passed on implicitly and unconsciously through imitation and practice rather than just explicit verbal teaching. Haidt's theory, of course, is brilliant, and I think he's right. I think he's essentially right. But it's not entirely original. Nietzsche made nearly the exact same argument as Jonathan Haidt did more than 100 years before Haidt's theory was published in his book Daybreak. I'm going to read what Nietzsche said about this, and I quote, "It is clear that moral feelings are transmitted in this way. Children observe in adults inclinations for and aversions to certain actions and, as born apes, imitate these inclinations and aversions. In later life, they find themselves full of these acquired and well-exercised affects and consider it only decent to try to account for and justify them. This accounting, however, has nothing to do with either the origin or the degree of intensity of the feeling. All one is doing is complying with the rule that as a rational being, one has to have reasons for one's for and against, and that they have to be adducible and acceptable reasons. To this extent, the history of moral feelings is quite different from the history of moral concepts. The former are powerful before the action, the latter, especially after the action, in the face of the need to pronounce upon it." End quote. And so Nietzsche is making the same claim that Haidt is making here, right? Feelings, intuitions, come first, right? And accounting, reasoning, comes afterwards to pronounce upon or to justify those initial feelings or intuitions. So a moral matrix, right? A moral matrix typically leads people to believe that their morality is true in some time-independent sense, or it's objective. And this belief in the objectivity of morality has a function. It serves to blind people to the coherence of alternative moral matrices, right? Moral frameworks. Jonathan Haidt said this about it in The Righteous Mind, and I quote, "Moral matrices bind people together and blind them to the coherence or even existence of other matrices. This makes it very difficult for people to consider the possibility that there might really be more than one form of moral truth or more than one valid framework for judging people or running a society." End quote. To occupy a moral matrix, right, is to believe that you have the truth about morality, and all the other moral matrices are wrong or delusional or whatever. And that is, of course, how many people think, right? You see this in debates about abortion, I think most clearly, right? If you're an activist on one side or the other, you have the truth about abortion, right? You have the truth, and everybody else is wrong or stupid or evil. The conservative activist and the progressive activist are equally convinced, right? Equally convinced of the absolute certainty of their moral righteousness. And so they don't think of their opinions as being mere opinions, right? There's something more than that. There's something that's either right or wrong, right? Like in a definite sense, in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4. And that is the way that many people think about their moral ideals, right? They're obviously right. And if you disagree, you're obviously stupid or evil. That's what morality is in some sense. It's that attitude about behavioral principles, let's say. And we have good data that people really do think this way. So Goodwin and Daly in a 2008 paper showed that people treat moral or ethical statements, so for example about the morality of robbery or the morality of cheating, almost as objectively as they treat factual statements. And I'm not going to go through their study in detail. The reference will be in the description. So the perceived objectivity of a moral norm is correlated with how important somebody thinks it is. So the more important you think a moral norm is, the more likely you are to perceive that as being an objective fact about reality, right? And this is why, for the abortion debate, right? Like, it's the activists on either side who feel extremely strongly about it. They're the ones who are acting as if they have some absolute objective truth. But that's the way it is for all such moral debates, right? The people who feel the most strongly about it are the ones who have this strong intuition that they're absolutely right, and that anybody who disagrees is absolutely, wrong in some objective sense. But given the fact that there's widespread moral disagreement in our culture about things like affirmative action, abortion, and other issues, this poses a real problem, right? Because this means that many people are occupying different worlds, right? Different and incompatible worlds, where it's not just that, it's that the objective facts are different for them. The facts about the world are fundamentally different. We're going to come back to this issue in a later video. But this treating of moral propositions as objective is a way to like that's what it's for in some sense, I would argue, is for making it so that moral matrices are mutually incompatible, right? They cannot coexist together without conflict. So why is it, right? Why is it that people so often perceive moral norms as objective? And this is a question that's been dealt with recently in the literature in moral psychology. Kyle Stanford, in this 2018 Behavioral and Brain Sciences paper, asked it in this way. He said, "What's the difference between ice cream and Nazis?" Right. Well, there's probably a lot of differences, but the difference we're concerned with here is that if somebody were to tell me that they preferred pistachio ice cream over chocolate, I might think, well, you have bad taste. Chocolate ice cream is clearly better, but I wouldn't like judge them in some sense. I mean, it's a subjective opinion, right? It's no big deal. But if somebody, and the same thing is true, of course, for things like music and movies and fashion choices, right? I may think that somebody has bad taste, but I don't think they're like objectively wrong about these things. But if somebody were to tell me, actually, I think that Hitler was a good guy and the Nazis should have won, well, that's a little different, right? Like, we don't treat that like it's just an opinion. We don't say, I prefer the Allies and you prefer the Nazis and no big deal, right? Like, that's not how we would treat that at all. We would be compelled in some sense to treat the person who was on the side of the Nazis as if they were objectively wrong in some sense. They've gotten something fundamentally wrong about reality, right? That is how we intuitively think about things that we feel strongly morally about. So the question is, why do we have this strong intuition about moral objectivity? So, before we get into that, we need to talk about what objectivity even means. And it's kind of a slippery term. And what I'm using it to refer to here is a situation where we cannot disagree about the statement without somebody being wrong, right? So, if I were to say the sky is blue and you were to say, no, the sky is lime green, okay, well, somebody is wrong about that, right? Whatever the correct answer is, there is a correct answer, right? And that makes it an objective question, right, as to whether the sky is blue or the sky is lime green, right? The Battle of Waterloo, it either did or didn't take place. If you say it did take place and I say it didn't take place, only one of us can be correct. There is an actual answer to that question. There's an objective answer to that question. So whether or not chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream is not really like that, right? We wouldn't say that there's a definite correct answer to that question. So that's the difference that I'm, making between objective and subjective here. So as Stanford put it in his 2018 paper, and I quote, "We experience prototypical moral norms, demands, and obligations as imposed unconditionally, irrespective of not only our own preferences and desires, but also those of any and all agents whatsoever, including those of any social group or arrangement to which we belong. We apply them not only to ourselves and our fellow community members, but also to absolutely any candidate social partner with whom we might interact. No authority is capable of suspending the demands they impose, and we regard violations of them as more serious and more deserving of punishment than violations of the merely conventional rules that we collectively self-impose. There is correspondingly less room for intersubjective disagreement without error concerning them, indeed, nearly as little as in the case of empirical or scientific fact." End quote. Okay, what he is describing here is the moral matrix, essentially, right? We experience what we consider moral, right? We experience it as being imposed unconditionally, right? Irrespective of our own perspective, irrespective of our preferences and desires, and it's imposed unconditionally onto everybody, right? All rational agents must behave morally, and there is, what this does is it provides no room for disagreement about it, and that's the point, right? That's the function of it. There is nearly little room for disagreement as there is in the case of empirical or scientific facts, as we saw with the Goodwin paper. So why is it that we do this, right? Why do we construe morality as objective or as externally imposed? And the short answer is because morality only works when nearly everybody in a group agrees about it, right? One of the functions of morality, as Jonathan Haidt has argued, is to bind groups of people together. And this binding function does not work if half of the group disagrees with the other half about some very important moral norm. And so by construing morality as being externally imposed or as being objective, it makes disagreement much more difficult, and that has a functional role to play. It functions to keep groups binded together through their shared moral assumptions, their shared moral matrix. And the person who would disagree with something like the sky being blue, we would call that person a madman, right? If somebody insisted against all reason and all evidence that the sky is actually green, right, we would insist that this person is inflicted by some kind of madness. But this is not far off from how we would treat somebody who disagrees with us about an important moral norm. Right? To disagree with a well-established moral norm, you have to either be evil or stupid or insane, at least in the eyes of the group. And going back to the Hitler example, is that not how we would treat somebody who insisted that Hitler was on the right side of history or insisted that Hitler was a good guy? And of course, we can think of Kanye West, who kind of did this recently. And of course, we know how he was treated. And I'm not saying it was wrong to treat him that way. I'm just saying that is how we treat people who disagree with us about these deep-seated moral norms. We treat them as if they're an insane person. And that makes it easier to ostracize that person. And so this is how morality is kept in line, right? It's how people are kept in line in terms of moral matrices, because anybody within that moral matrix who deviates from it is treated as if they're an insane person. And that makes it easier to enforce these moral norms. So this does not mean, of course, that morality is actually objective. Right? That's not what I'm claiming here. Right? It just means that treating morality as objective is a useful strategy for enforcing the moral norms that bind groups of people together. So this is the matrix, right? This is the matrix of morality, as Jonathan Haidt has put it, right? It's the consensual hallucination that we, right? It's a consensual hallucination that we have the truth about morality and everyone else has to be either ignorant or stupid or evil. So as Haidt put it in The Righteous Mind, each moral matrix provides a complete, unified, and emotionally compelling worldview, easily justified by observable evidence and nearly impregnable to attack by arguments from outsiders. Elsewhere he said, and I quote, "When early humans began to share intentions, their ability to hunt, gather, raise children, and raid their neighbors increased exponentially. Everyone on the team now had a mental representation of the task, knew that his or her partners shared the same representation, knew when a partner had acted in a way that impeded success or that hogged the spoils, and reacted negatively to such violations. When everyone in a group began to share a common understanding of how things were supposed to be done, and then felt a flash of negativity when any individual violated those expectations, the first moral matrix was born. That, I believe, was our Rubicon crossing," end quote, our Rubicon crossing into being modern humans. So we have this strong intuition that morality is objective, right? That morality is externally imposed or objective. And here I want to talk about the evolution of that intuition. And I'm going to suggest that it's essentially equivalent to what Nietzsche referred to as the herd instinct. So Chudek and Henrich, in this 2011 paper called Culture, Gene, Coevolution, Norm Psychology, and the Emergence of Human Prosociality, they argue that humans have evolved a sophisticated norm psychology, what they call the norm psychology, that strongly compels us to conform to the social norms of our particular group. And so here we're going to ask, how is it that this norm psychology or the herd instinct, and I'm going to suggest this is the same thing as what Nietzsche called the herd instinct. It's an instinct for conformity, essentially. We're going to look at how this evolved. So it's just the case, right? So, groups compete with each other, right? Groups of human beings compete with each other, either directly through warfare, but also even in times of peace, indirectly through economic growth and things like this. And groups that have more functional social norms would have outcompeted groups with less functional social norms, right? Just as a general rule. And groups had an incentive to enforce conformity to social norms within the group. Not only just because the social norms are good, but also just because if everybody's on the same page, everybody becomes more predictable to each other and it's easier to cooperate. So as Chudek and Henrich put it in their paper, and I quote, "The central theoretical insight stemming from the norm psychology account is that once individuals can culturally learn social behavior with sufficient fidelity, self-enforcing stable states will spontaneously emerge in social groups. The self-reinforcing nature of norms will lead to competition among groups with different norms, varying in prosociality, and to selection pressures within groups to avoid deviations." End quote. So not only do we instinctually conform to the social norms of our group, we also have this instinct to punish, largely just through social rejection or social disapproval, people who flout those norms, people who don't adhere to the norms of the group. And so in this way, groups enforce conformity. Now, this is not an absolute thing, right? Because groups also have an interest in allowing for a certain amount of individuality, right? Because it's still the case that the norms have to be transcended every once in a while. So there's always this sort of balance between enforcing conformity and allowing individuality to flourish, right? And finding the proper balance between those things is not an easy task at all, I would suggest. So Nietzsche, who I think is perhaps the greatest intuitive psychologist of all time, comments on how the herd instinct manifests in us. It manifests in us as a fear of the disapproval of our peers, essentially. He said, and I quote, "The reproach of conscience is, even in the most conscientious, weak against the feeling that this and that is against the good custom of your society. A cold look, a wry mouth on the part of those among whom and for whom one was raised is still feared even by the strongest. What is really feared here? Isolation, as the argument that refutes even the best arguments for a person or cause. So speaks the herd instincts out of us." Or the herd instinct, end quote. And so that's really what is feared, right? It's isolation from your group, because of course that's a death sentence for most of human history. And to be expelled from the group would have very likely been a common punishment, rather than directly killing somebody, even just not, just ostracizing them from the group, or refusing to cooperate with them, right? Well, that's essentially a death sentence. It's certainly a death sentence for your evolutionary success within that group. And so we have evolved a fear of this being isolated from the group. And that's essentially the herd instinct in us. And that's what keeps us embedded in the moral matrix of our groups, right? Deviation from the moral norms of a group will be met with hostility and social rejection. And the fear of that keeps the vast majority of people from questioning the moral assumptions of their in-group. Now, I would say it also keeps them from questioning the strongly held beliefs as well, even non-moral beliefs, right? Because some beliefs are moralized, right? So like if you're raised by strongly, traditionally Christian parents, and you're embedded in that world, there's going to be social costs if you deviate from that in adulthood. And this group conformity is necessary in some sense. We talked about this in part one in terms of the cultural ratcheting process, where imitation is a big part of cultural ratcheting. You have to blindly imitate what came before, and that imitation is enforced to some extent by the group. This adherence to tradition is a foundation of cultural evolution. Innovation is necessary too, but it comes with a cost. We'll talk more about that cost in a future video. So here I'm going to make the case that the advent of agriculture changed the way that human beings do morality in a very profound way, largely drawing here on Michael Tomasello's work in A Natural History of Human Morality. In the approximately 140,000 years of human history leading up to the advent of agriculture, so we've probably been basically human, who knows, 150 to 200,000 years, right? In terms of being modern humans. But for most of that time, we did not have what you would think of as explicit laws or rules, or, there was maybe like taboos and things like that, but we didn't have written explicit laws, and there was no notion of universal morality. Like we tend to think of morality now as being universal. That was not the way that our ancestors thought about it at all. Instead, human groups adhered to what I'm going to refer to as the ethic of custom. Tomasello calls it the morality of custom. This is just a semantic difference between us. I wouldn't call what these groups are doing morality, really. I wouldn't say that it's morality. And neither did Nietzsche. Nietzsche called it the ethic of custom. Tomasello calls it the morality of custom, but whatever. We're referring to the same thing here. So this is how he describes the ethic of custom. And I quote, this is how Tomasello describes it, and I quote, "In many cases, we will say that the members of a particular culture insist that this is the way that we do things. Members of a culture insist that this is the way things are done, the right way to do them, the way that any rational or moral person would do them. These different ways of talking are all intended to be more or less equivalent because, again, the focus is on modern humans before the rise of civil societies. For these early modern humans, We in this group are humans, and the other similar looking creatures that we sometimes see in the distance or interact with cautiously and with little comprehension are barbarians, and so not really humans at all. We know the right way to do things. They do not. It is in this sense, from this internal perspective, that a cultural, group-minded way of thinking is objective, end quote. And so for early pre-agricultural humans, morality, right, or the ethic of custom is just the way that we do things, right? It's not objective. It's not universal. It's not, it's not like imposed by a transcendent God or anything like that. It's just, often it was accompanied by ancestor worship, right? Our venerated ancestors gave us these traditions, and we honor them by adhering to these traditions, and that's the way that we do things. Tomasello goes on to say, and I quote, this objective perspective on the correct and incorrect ways to do things is further fortified by a historical dimension. Cultural practices are not just how we Waziris do things now, but how our people have always done them. Net fishing in this way is not just we in our group do, not just what we in our group do, and so what you should do, but what our venerated ancestors have done forever. It ensures our survival as a people, and it distinguishes us from the barbarians across the river. It is the correct way to do things. As modern human individuals grew into their cultures, they were thus learning the objectively right way to do things. And when they were explicitly taught these practices by adults, they did not experience this teaching as from individuals stating their opinion or giving their advice. They experienced it as the authoritative voice of the culture on how things are and how one must behave, end quote. The norms and customs of the group, were experienced as objective in the sense that, they were passed down to us by our venerated ancestors. And this is the way that all rational, right-thinking people do things, right? We all use our fishnets in this particular way. And this discourages innovation to a large extent, but that's necessary, right? It's necessary for the cultural ratcheting effect to take place. You can't have everybody innovating all the time. Innovation came with a cost, and we'll talk quite a bit later on, about how that cost was often essentially madness, right? Essentially, the innovator had to be somebody who essentially, was kind of a crazy person, because that's how they had to be seen in the eyes of their group. And so this was the ethic of custom. Nietzsche recognized the same phenomenon, and John Richardson talks about this in his book Nietzsche's Values, and this is how he talks about it, and I quote, "As a society lasts and grows, it forms a picture of itself as a lasting society, held together by customs and laws, which are enduring procedures and principles in which its values are codified. This is the long developmental stage that Nietzsche calls the ethic of custom. But the mode of address of these external values remains the same. They are commanded and are persuasive and compelling as commands. Society, therefore, needs a new way to personify a commander of its lasting values. Nietzsche describes in the Genealogy of Morals how laws were given personal authority by being attributed to the ancestors taken to have founded society. The authority of these founding fathers, their having commanded these values, sets the values up outside us as binding on us," end quote. And that's really important because we're talking here about morality in the sense of being externally imposed. So this is how the pre-agricultural groups did that external imposition. They set them up as having been commanded by our venerated ancestors. We in our group do these things this way. So they weren't objective fully because they didn't apply to all humans or all, they only applied to that group. But of course, that group thought of themselves really as the only real humans. So agriculture changed everything, right? Because when we came together into civilizations, many groups with different ancestral histories had to come together, and they had to figure out a new way to do morality, given that they don't have shared ancestors. Michael Tomasello comments on this, and he says, and I quote, "The rise of agriculture and the cities it spawned was, of course, a monumental event in the history of human sociality. When human groups began coming to the food, people with very different cultural practices, who spoke different languages, ate different foods, wore different clothes, engaged in different forms of hygiene, and so forth, all came to live in close proximity to one another. And because they were sedentary, they had to find ways to get along, despite some different social norms and values. And of course, agriculture meant that some individuals were able to dominate the surplus of food and use it as capital to wield power over others. Creating cooperative arrangements in these new social circumstances required some new supra-individual regulatory devices. Most important from the point of view of modern human morality were law and organized religion. End quote. So after the advent of agriculture, we had groups coming together into larger civilizations. They have different cultural histories, different ways of doing things, and they have to figure out how to get along. And so this led eventually, it led to the formation of explicit laws, right? So this is how we're going to do things, and we write them down, and they're very explicit and precise, but also organized religion, which eventually created these big gods, right? So like gods that imposed morality from the outside, and that everybody had to adhere to. So 3 major changes that are relevant to this discussion came about after the advent of civilization, right? We saw the rise of these dogmatic priesthoods, which we've talked about in this part as well, the rise of written laws, explicit commandments like the 10 Commandments, and dogmas like religious dogmas, which don't really exist in the same way in hunter-gatherer groups. They do kind of, but not in the same way as doctrinal religions. We've talked about that in previous videos, so I won't go into it too much here. And then we see the rise of big moralizing gods. So this would be like Ahura Mazda with Zoroastrianism, and Allah, and of course Yahweh, and of course Christianity has a big moralizing god as well, or at least mainstream Christianity does. And all of these things function, right? They have a purpose, right? They stabilized moral norms in the face of the moral conflict which was created by these different groups coming together into a civilization. They imposed some stability onto that chaos. So, in this video, I hope that I have established a few things, right? That in the first place, pure altruism does not exist in nature because everyone is always pursuing their evolved interests, right? Consciously or unconsciously. We can't do anything else. If you try, your instincts will fight against you, right? These evolved, what you might call psychological adaptations, instincts, drives, or whatever, they're not going to be shut off so easily, right? Just because you want them to be. They make themselves known to you whether you like it or not. And so we cannot do anything in some sense except for pursue our evolved interests. We can do it consciously or we can do it unconsciously. Conventional morality is fundamentally about adhering to the strictures of a group. That's why it evolved, and when we came together into a civilization, it had to become more subtle in some sense because we no longer had a shared cultural history. We had to figure out other ways of doing it. So, if promoting pure altruism is impossible, what is it that the ascetic ideal is actually doing when it elevates altruism over egoism? So Nietzsche provided an answer to this question, and this is what he said about it, and I quote, "Not egoistic and unegoistic is the fundamental pair of contraries that has led men to distinguish moral and immoral, good and evil, but rather being tied to a tradition and law and detachment from them. How the tradition originated is indifferent. In any case, it was without any regard for good and evil or any imminent categorical imperative, but above all in order to preserve a community, a people," end quote. All morality stems from that imperative, the imperative to preserve a community or a people. That is the origin of all morality, as far as I'm concerned. What I would call morality anyways. So here's the thing. Some people think that some people call everything nice that everybody does morality, right? So that's not what I mean by morality, right? I mean something that is that we feel as being unconditionally or externally imposed on us from the outside, right? So I love my family, right? I love my family. Okay. Do I need to do that? Am I doing that because I'm moral or something? No, it doesn't make any sense. It's part of my nature to love my family, right? It's not moral or immoral, right? It's just, Nietzsche said everything done out of love is beyond good and evil. And it is. I want, humanity is facing a number of existential threats at the moment. And I would really prefer it if humanity didn't get wiped out. Is that because of morality? Do I care about that because I've been, because I need to have some external imposition? No, of course not, right? I have an interest in humanity surviving, a real, genuine interest. It's an instinct, right? It's not morality. Like, screw that. If you need morality to tell you that, that you would like for humanity to survive into the future, then I really like what's going on inside of you that you need morality for that. There's something really messed up in there. So for most stuff, we don't need morality. Right? Morality is irrelevant, right? I don't go around murdering people. Maybe there's been a few people I'd like to have killed in my life, but generally speaking, I don't murder people because I don't want to, right? You don't need an externally imposed morality for that. Externally imposed morality is fundamentally about enforcing adherence to the long-held morals of the group. It's fundamentally what it's about. So the morality of the ascetic ideal was fundamentally about elevating the herd instinct over any notion of individual autonomy. That is what the elevation of altruism over egoism was fundamentally about. To be moral, in this view, is to adhere to the laws and strictures laid out by your culture or your religion. Those laws and strictures may become more subtle later on. They may be construed as being rational, right? And I've talked about this. I'm not going to go into detail about this here. I have a long essay on my Substack called "Utilitarianism is Slave Morality for Nerds," where I argue that this is what utilitarianism is. It's taking these fundamentally Christian moral intuitions and rationalizing them. But that doesn't mean that they're objective in any sense. So to be immoral in this view is to break these laws or strictures or principles or whatever. But of course, the ascetic ideal was different than the ethic of custom because morality was elevated so that it came from the voice of God, or like the voice of a transcendent creator God, or from rationality, which hopefully I've established a connection between these two things at this point, because that God, that external transcendent creator God and rationality, as it's normally construed, they're very closely related. We're going to talk more about that in the next video. And so the ascetic ideal made morality universal in the sense that the morality did not just apply to our people. It doesn't just apply to us. It applies to any rational person, right? All people. But that just makes it more difficult to escape, right? It makes it more difficult to escape that matrix of morality because now it's all encompassing in some sense. So why is it that the elevation of altruism over egoism is pathological? Okay, I will argue that it's largely for three reasons. In the first place, because altruism in any pure sense is impossible. It's simply not the kind of creatures that we are. Anybody who hopes to attain that ideal will either see themselves as a complete failure, so they're going to be guilty about it, and mired with inner conflict. And another possibility is that they'll just self-deceive themselves into thinking that they actually are behaving in that way when really they're not at all, right? Because we're always pursuing our evolved interests. There's no way of getting out of that. That's what we are, right? That's the kind of creature we are. It's the kind of creature that all creatures are. So the second reason is because this elevation implicitly promotes hyperconformity to the group norms, the group values, right? You'll be accused of being selfish or whatever. And a certain amount of conformity to group norms and values is necessary, but it can go too far. When you're burning people at the stake for questioning the assumptions of Christian beliefs or whatever kind of religious beliefs, I think you've gone a little too far. And the third reason, and maybe this is the most important reason actually, although it's probably the most controversial in some senses, because I think the healthy person, right, like true psychological health comes from integrating your selfish motivations with your selfless or altruistic motivations, which are not really different, right? You may think of them as different, but they have the same ultimate source, but you want to integrate them into a seamless whole so that there's no conflict between them. And the elevation of altruism precludes that kind of integration. It makes it seem like a bad thing. And we're going to come back to talk about that more in a future video, but I'm going to say one thing about it now, which is just to quote Abraham Maslow here. So Abraham Maslow studied healthy people. He studied people who he called self-actualizing people who are fulfilling their potential in the world. And this is one of the observations that he had about them in terms of whether they were selfish or selfless or whatever. He said about them, and I quote, One observation I made has puzzled me for many years, but it begins to fall into place now. It was what I described as the resolution of dichotomies in self-actualizing people. Briefly stated, I found that I had to see differently many oppositions and polarities that all psychologists had taken for granted as straight-line continua. For instance, to take the first dichotomy that I had trouble with, I couldn't decide whether my subjects were selfish or unselfish. Observe how spontaneously we fall into an either-or here. The more of one, the less of the other is the implication of the style in which I put the question. But I was forced by sheer pressure of fact to give up this Aristotelian style of logic. My subjects were very unselfish in one sense and very selfish in another sense, and the two fused together, not like incompatibles, but rather in a sensible, dynamic unity or synthesis. My subjects had put opposites together in such a way as to make me realize that regarding selfishness and unselfishness as contradictory and mutually exclusive is itself characteristic of a lower level of personality development. End quote. As far as I'm concerned, that's 100% correct. The optimal personality development fuses what you might call selfishness and selflessness into a coherent synthesis, where you're pursuing goals that are not selfish. Like you're not, stealing TVs from people. Okay, like that would be purely selfish. You're pursuing goals that you might consider altruistic, but of course you're not like falling on your sword for them. You're not, it's not purely you have to get what you want out of life too. And if you don't do that, if you don't have some kind of selfishness, you'll just get resentful, or you'll just say, oh, life is so unfair and all this. Well, no. It's that you didn't demand out of life what you need from it. So you have to have both of those things, where you have to pursue selfish goals, but at the same time, you can't do that in such a way that in the first place that you're going to like piss off everybody around you. You would like to do it in such a way that other people will actually like you for doing it and like reward you with potentially money or status or whatever for doing it. And so the altruistic and egoistic motivations get fused together, and that's optimal, I would suggest, and Maslow would suggest. And so by elevating altruism over egoism, the ascetic ideal makes optimal personality development a kind of sin. It makes it like it's a bad thing, but this is a pathology. So coming back to this issue of left hemisphere versus right hemisphere, autistic-like traits versus positive schizotypy, I've argued that the advent of agriculture benefited people high in autistic-like traits. They tended to become cultural leaders through the priesthood, especially. They tended to become these ascetic priests in these societies. And so is there some reason to believe that the new ways of doing law and morality that came about after the advent of agriculture would have been more appealing to people high in autistic-like traits? Not only more appealing, but also would it be more likely that they would be likely to create these new kinds of systems? And I'm going to argue that it's very likely that people of that particular temperament would be more likely than other people to frame objective moralities and also to frame explicit written laws and things like that, right? Precise laws. So I'm going to read what Simon Baron-Cohen wrote about morality within autism spectrum conditions in his book, The Science of Evil. And I quote, he says, despite low levels of empathy, people with autism spectrum conditions do not, for the most part, act in cruel ways towards others. These individuals have developed their moral codes through systemizing. They have a strong desire to live by rules and expect others to do the same for reasons of fairness. Recent theories see super-developed moral codes in people with autism who are intolerant of those who bend the rules. People with Asperger's syndrome are often the first to leap to the defense of someone who is being treated unfairly because it violates the moral system they have constructed through brute logic alone. As such, people who are zero-positive, meaning those with Asperger's, are often among the law enforcers, not the law breakers. They want their positive status. They warrant their positive status because they systemize to an extreme degree. Okay, so the point here being that people on the spectrum or people high in autistic-like traits often have these, what he calls super-developed moral codes, and they are intolerant of people who violate their moral codes. And this is a result of their systemizing tendency. So they have this precise perceptual system, right? We've talked about this before. They have a precise perceptual system, and that applies to everything, right? It applies to morality and laws too. They're less, there's less room for ambiguity in the moralistic thinking of somebody who's high in autistic-like traits. Now, one thing I disagree with here is that he says that their moral system is created through brute logic. No, this is not the case. It's a purely, so this is a philosophical issue in some sense, but it's impossible to create a moral system through brute logic. They do it the same way that everybody else does. They are enculturated in a society with certain moral intuitions, and they rationalize those moral intuitions. I talk about this again in my essay called Utilitarianism is Slave Morality for Nerds. I go into that in more detail. I'm not going to talk about it too much here. But there's a difference in the way that they rationalize their moral intuitions, because they do so in a more precise, more systematic way where there's less room for ambiguity. And that can be a good thing sometimes, but not all the time. Right? The ambiguity is actually kind of important in the real world. So Temple Grandin, who is a really remarkable person who has autism, she became very successful designing slaughterhouses for cattle. And you can see her designs on the internet. They're really kind of amazing. And she's a remarkable person. But she wrote these books about her experience with autism. And this is what she said about her attitude towards rules. And I quote, "For people with autism, rules are very important because we concentrate intensely on how things are done. I always took the rules seriously and won the confidence of my teachers. People who trust me have always been a big help. But many people have difficulty deciphering how people with autism understand rules. Since I don't have any social intuition, I rely on pure logic, like an expert computer program, to guide my behavior." End quote. Okay, so This is the thing. Like, this is why people who are on that side of the spectrum, and of course, Temple Grandin's an extreme example, right? So this is a continuum, and some people are going to be more or less like this. But if you lack social intuition, let's say, if you lack that kind of intuition that helps to navigate complex social situations, so you have to rely on a couple things, right? For one, rules to guide your own behavior, but also rules to be able to predict the behavior of other people. And that's just as important, maybe more important. Other people are rendered predictable to the extent that they share the same rules and laws that you do, and that they actually follow them. And if they don't follow them, that renders them unpredictable. And I would suggest, and I think the evidence suggests, that people on the autism side of this continuum don't like that, right? They don't like it when people behave unpredictably, especially when it involves that kind of rule breaking. And of course, there are going to be large differences. I'm not saying that everybody on that side of the continuum is like that, right? There's going to be individual differences, but that attitude does tend to manifest on that side of the continuum more often. So the systemizing tendency and the need for order that we've talked about having characterizes autistic-like traits is also carried over into the realm of morality, right? Moral rigidity and a hyper-focus on following rules or adhering to strict moral principles is not unheard of among people on the spectrum. And again, I'm not saying everybody is like this, but it's an empirically documented phenomenon. As Baron-Cohen put it, they are more likely to be law enforcers than they are law breakers. The formal laws and objective rules-based moralities like the Ten Commandments that emerged in many places after the advent of agriculture would, I suggest, likely have been promoted by and to be more appealing to those who are high in autistic-like traits, right? The priesthoods within these societies. And while these new ways of doing law and morality were very likely necessary at that time, I'm not making any moral judgment about this, just to be clear. I mean, I think that these things emerged because they were a necessary step in our developmental process, let's say. They become a problem, however, when they are so rigidly enforced that they cannot be updated or broken when necessary, and that does happen in some places over time. But they're also a problem when we find ourselves in a situation in which there's a lot of moral diversity, which is the modern world that we find ourselves in, right? Thinking about morality as if it's externally imposed or objective. This is a problem if you have a huge amount of moral diversity within a society, because then people just can't even talk to each other, right? If everybody's occupying a different moral matrix, they can't even talk to or really cooperate with each other. And we're going to talk more about that problem in a future video. So to recap what I've talked about in this video, I made the case that pure altruism is impossible. It's not a thing that exists in nature. You are always pursuing your adaptive goals, and we have a myriad number of ways of doing that. But you can't do anything else because that's just what you are, right? Those motivations that are within you, those are the motivations that have resulted from a long evolutionary process, and they're always affecting your behavior. You can deceive yourself into thinking that you're doing something else, but you're not, right? You're always doing that. But these motivations cannot be neatly categorized as being selfish or selfless. And that means that your evolutionary self, if you want to think about it that way, is extended into the world, right? The boundaries of your self do not end at your skin, right? They're in your family and in the people who you have interdependent relationships with, your friends, your community, your culture, and the world at large, right? Your interests are extended out into the world at large. And so that means that altruism and egoism are really a false dichotomy. And that the healthy person, sees them for what they are as that false dichotomy, or at least acts as if they do. Moral objectivity, right? The idea that our moral principles are objective, or in some sense, is equivalent to a matrix, right? Which is a consensual hallucination. And it precludes people from seeing the coherence of alternative moralities, right? Jonathan Haidt does a great job of discussing this in The Righteous Mind. The elevation of altruism over egoism is pathological for multiple reasons. It induces guilt because it's an impossible ideal. It induces conformity because that's what all morality is for, really. And it precludes our ability to become psychologically integrated and therefore psychologically healthy. And I also made the case that the new ways of doing law and morality after the advent of agriculture, which were these precise written laws and the more objective systematic moralities that were divorced from time and context, which is important, right? So if you're in the ethic of custom, your morality was dependent on your particular time and place, right? You as a people, right? Like that morality was for you as a people in that particular time and place. When we make morality fully objective or fully universal, we get rid of that historical component to it, and we see it as being something static that's never changing or that can't change or something like that, which is a problem. So anyways, these systematic moralities were very likely invented and or encouraged by the priests, and what the priests were very likely people who were high in autistic-like traits. And that is it for video 4 of part 5. I think that's enough for that. And in the final video, we're going to bring all of this together and talk about a very interesting book called The God of the Left Hemisphere. And we're going to see how some people who had that poetic or prophetic mind picked up on this pattern that we've been talking about in part 5. They picked up on it intuitively and implicitly. William Blake being the most, I think, obvious example of that. So we'll get into that in the next video. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you there.